essential tool for the work with shadows and other fascinating appearances of the light is of course the light itself. And this is why it deserves a very special attention. Every light source creates, depending on its physical composition, a different kind of picture, a different shadow. A candle casts another shadow than a halogen light would do, and that casts another one than an LED light would do, and so on. And therefore, as soon as you know what you want to tell, as soon as you know your story, you have to decide which light source you want to tell it with. This decision has a very great impact on everything that follows. For example, the size of your figures, of your puppets. Do you really have to have big ones, tall ones? Or can you allow yourself to have smaller ones, which means in the end you have to carry less weight? Do you have to touch the screen with your puppet? Or can you allow yourself to leave the screen and move it in the open space? What happens then? Brightness is important. For example, telling a story with, let's say, a candle for an audience of 200 is quite an adventure. Is it heavy, your light? Does it have to be fixed somewhere up there behind you? Or can you take it in your hand and move it? What happens then? Does it get hot like a 100-watt bulb, which means you could hurt yourself? A first orientation among these huge number of light sources which are available today is to divide them into 3 groups. The first one then consists all the light sources which are of no use at all for the work with shadows and in shadow theater. These are neon lights, extremely bright ones, let's say everything above 100 watt, 150, 250, 500, 1000 watt, you can forget them. And also the so-called energy-saving lamps belong to this first group. Each of them is useless for our work, and I can show you why. I have one here. Here it is, and as long as I use it in the traditional Asian way, it's okay. My hand is on the screen. The shadow is caught in between my hand and the screen. It's sharp. The audience is on the other side. Everything is fine. But the moment I move it, see what happens? The tragedy begins. The shadow gets bigger and bigger and is blurred and blurred, and it's of no use for our work. The second group contains light sources that can be used for just an effect, or maybe even a whole scene. For example, a strobe. If your story allows it or even wants it, then use it. It's pulsing very, very fast, but then also very fast turn it off again, because nobody wants to look at it for a long time. But it changes the rhythm of your story, which might be very useful. It's nice if something changes, and it helps to tell your story, but it's just an effect. Something different is a light source for a whole scene, a candle, for example. This very old light source, it's very warm, it touches our heart, and if your story allows it, touch the hearts of your audience. And as long as you stay on the screen, it's okay. The audience might sit on the other side, see the shadow, and everything is fine. But the moment you leave it, you leave the screen, see what happens. It's a bit better than the energy-saving bulb, but not really very sharp. It gets blurred, and the amount of light is not very much, and the candle is very susceptible to the air. And it's an open fire, which means think about if you use it. But for a scene, it's okay. The last group finally contains the light sources that you can use to tell a whole story. And they're all either halogen or LED lights. But even here, you cannot just take one and say, that's an LED, that will do. even here you have to have a close look what you're taking. For example, this is an LED torch, and I'll show you what it does. Here it is, and as long as I touch the screen, no problem. The moment I leave the screen, you see what happens, the shadow gets bigger, and even though this is an LED light, look what it does to the shadow. It gets blurred and even a bit scary. Not very useful for our work. I have another LED torch here. I start again the traditional way on the screen, and I leave the screen. Even though I leave the screen, you see what happens to the shadow? It remains sharp. Suddenly there's a total difference. This is already quite a good shadow to work with. And exactly because of this, because of the possibility to leave the screen, the shadow gets bigger and remains sharp, it was possible that the traditional Asian shadow play transformed itself into modern shadow theater. It was the conquest of the space. Suddenly, the actor could start to move in the space and show to the audience what they're doing. But more about this later on. Conclusion. There are many light sources on the market today, and only few of them, very few of them, are useful for the work with shadows and shadow theater. Some are quite nice for an effect or even for a whole scene. But the good ones, the real good ones, are those that allow you to leave the screen, the shadow gets bigger, but it remains sharp, a crisp shadow. There are blurred shadows all around. The sharp ones are the precious ones. And how you create them and how exactly the light sources have to be to get a sharp shadow, this I will tell you in my next tutorial called Good Light. See you there.